Yep, it finally happened. They met. Trump and Putin shaking hands, discussing the fate of the world. And then an Alaskan absurdity arose. There are many dimensions to the story, though, so let's work our way through all of them. Because this is just the beginning of a much longer peace process that will no doubt have further hiccups along the way. So sit down, enjoy some surprise bombers, a lunch that never came to pass, and a press conference contest to say the most words without saying anything at all. I should start with a disclaimer. As a general rule, what happens in these types of negotiations makes up only a tiny fraction of a state's overall bargaining power. What really matters are what forms the lines on maps. Think hard metal and big booms. The vast majority of the real game is accumulating all of that leverage beforehand. Things like building the previously alluded to weapons, or convincing your friends to also build a bunch of weapons. What happens at an actual summit is just the public-facing finishing touches. Actually, the stock footage from the NATO Hague Summit serves a dual purpose here. It both boosted Western bargaining power, and is an example of how a summit itself did not directly do much. The real work happened behind the scenes, and then everyone hopes that no one fumbles the football as they are about to punch it into the end zone. As another disclaimer, there were a couple of reasons to suspect that not much would happen entering today's summit. Yes, sorry, Team Nothing Ever Happens is at the top of the standings again this season. The summit came together in about a week. But as I just said, the real work for a summit takes place well before the start of the summit. 7 days is not enough to do that. Instead, it is an attempt to speedrun an end to the war. How might you go about doing that? Someone with a bad sense of causation might note that wars tend to end after a negotiation. So why not just skip to that part? Well, that is what we are getting here. But again, that skips the real work that goes into a summit. Some of that is diplomacy by lower-tier government officials, but a lot of it is communicating resolve and destroying capacity on the battlefield, which apparently there has not been enough of. The second reason to suspect that not much would happen was because Ukraine was not there. Keep this in mind for later. If you are fighting a war, then you get a veto in ending the war. It turns out that you can always just say, "No thanks, I prefer to continue to fight," and the war goes on. And thus, without Ukraine at the table, the United States and Russia could not make much progress in ending the war in Ukraine. Sure enough, the absurdities began as Russia traveled to the summit site, Joint Base Elmendorf-Richardson in Alaska. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov arrived wearing a sweatshirt bearing the letters CCCP, the Russian abbreviation for the USSR, and a country that did not exist when about half of my audience was born. Then came the news that the contingency of Russian reporters traveling to Alaska ate chicken Kyiv for dinner. Get it? Because Ukraine is on the menu. How hilarious and very clever. The real action, if we can call it that, began when Air Force One and the Russian equivalent landed and parked at the base. Then, continuing with the food theme, the two presidents seemingly played a game of chicken on who would be the first to step down. Seriously, why is it always chicken on this channel? Anyway, Trump emerged, and the media coverage essentially wrote itself. Red carpet. Trump clapping as Putin walked toward him. A handshake. Smiles. And yeah, I get that watching these sorts of images, if you are sitting in Kyiv right now, is not exactly a fun time. But goodness, this was over-reported in the media. Of course, I understand why this happens. It is a visual, and humans are visual creatures. It is easy to put this on a screen and explain why it is a bad thing that the President of the United States is shaking hands with someone that the International Criminal Court issued an arrest warrant against. It is much harder to explain how drone and counter-drone and counter-counter-drone interactions work. So the handshake analysis goes on for 2 hours. However, let this be your friendly reminder that what ultimately matters is what happens on the battlefield. Handshakes are a drop in the bucket compared to massive shipments of 155mm artillery shells that could overrun Russian positions, or endless ammunition for HIMARS that will decimate Russia's logistics. Maybe, Russian media playing this on loop will influence public opinion inside of Russia. Putin has been normalized back into part of the Western diplomatic sphere. He must be doing something right. But I would not overinterpret the utility here when the Russian media has a dozen other positive messages it could substitute into its nightly broadcasts. The real threat to the Kremlin arises when Russian citizens no longer can afford day-to-day basics. Your average Alexander cannot replace 3 square meals with a handshake, and thus what we really should be focusing on for later are the economic prospects coming out of this meeting. Then, just before they got to the stage for a photo op, wait, what's that in the air? Why, it's a B-2 bomber. The same design that recently dropped gigantic bombs over Iran's nuclear facilities. A bit of a silly flex that ultimately means nothing, though it probably briefly distracted everyone in the Russian military contingency, as they wondered whether there was anything useful to learn by seeing the flyover in person. Post-photo op, they moved into Trump's limousine. This itself was interesting. The White House originally planned to have a one-on-one meeting between Trump and Putin. Then, on the flight over, the US press learned that this was no longer on the agenda. The limo ride therefore reinserted a few one-on-one minutes into the trip. However, the real summit began in a restricted 3-on-3 format. This involved Putin, Lavrov, and Foreign Policy Advisor Yuri Yushakov on one side, and Trump, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, and Special Envoy to Russia Steve Witkoff on the other. Undoubtedly, Europeans breathed a sigh of relief when they learned that the one-on-one meeting would be replaced with a conversation that included Rubio. Rubio is the highest-ranked traditional Republican within the White House. He is a hawk on Russia and wants to strengthen Europe. Contrast Trump's warm welcome of Putin on the red carpet to this photo of Rubio during one of the preliminary negotiations with Russia back in February. Well, he may have had a lot to say. They spent hours in that room talking. What was supposed to happen next is that the six would shift into an expanded format over lunch. Whereas the first bit seemed more focused on world affairs, and thus the war in Ukraine. That expanded meeting appeared to be more geared toward economic cooperation. Indeed, economic advisors were invited to Putin's meeting preparation seen here, and they were also on the schedule for the expanded format. That did not happen. They skipped straight to the press conference. Putin spent the first 18 minutes saying a lot of flowery things that ultimately had nothing of substance. Quote, "I agree with Trump that the security of Ukraine must be secured, and, of course, we are ready to work on that." End quote. I am sure that he thinks that. I am also sure that his interpretation of that is very different than someone who lives in Europe. Then it was Trump's turn to talk. "There is no deal until there is a deal," he said, basically informing us that there was no real progress on negotiating an end to the war. Perhaps a positive spin on a failure to make progress. Trump said that he would speak to Zelensky and NATO partners next to fill them in on some of the details. There were no more specifics beyond that. And I would bet that we will not get much more in the way of details until some leaks start dripping out of the White House or Europe. That ended the press conference, which I am now having to use air quotes to describe, because there were no questions from the media. You can imagine how much fun that could have been with American reporters asking Putin something about what is happening in Ukraine. To get down to brass tacks, no ceasefire, no additional sanctions, primary or secondary, no additional arms to Ukraine, no firm plans for a next summit, though Putin's last words at the press conference, spoken in English, were an off-the-cuff invitation for a summit to Moscow. You know, as I was typing the script there, I wrote "dummit" instead of "summit," and maybe we should just stick with that from now on. The lack of a meeting among the economic advisors is telling, though. Reinitiating the trade relationship, never mind trying to expand on it, needs a peace deal to precede it. The long 3-on-3 meeting would suggest that the Kremlin is far away from reaching a deal, which makes a meeting among economic advisors irrelevant. At some point, this is going to change, though, and we should have a conversation about what that would look like whenever the next dummit is. To do that, we need to start with the central problem of negotiating a settlement while one party has the initiative. Yes, this is going to be the Munich 2.0 conversation, except I am not going to treat this as some massive and penetrating insight, as many of the articles you might read like to make it out to be. No, this is pretty straightforward. It is the domino problem that I keep talking about. But we need this as the basis of some more interesting insights for later. Thus, I'm going to do this as fast as I can, so much so that I am putting up a clock. Okay, go. Imagine that this is the front line at the start of the next dummit. As far as we can tell, if nothing changes, Russia will keep on advancing. Let's say maybe to here before its offensive peters out. Russia views this as an imperialist-style war, so it is best that we adopt that thinking for a moment. The Kremlin therefore would require something close to the expectation to be willing to reach a settlement. Maybe this space between the white and red lines represents its costs. The trouble is that if you move the front line to match Russia's minimally acceptable endpoint, then the expected outcome of the war also moves because Russia has just run straight through all of Ukraine's defensive lines. Thus, a new minimum for the Kremlin forms. See? Dominoes. And done in under a minute. Not bad. As I said, most observers at this point understand the domino dynamics, but there is a disconnect between that and an implication for a ceasefire. So let's now shift to discussing how to freeze the front. Indeed, the position of Ukraine, Europe, and even the United States from time to time is to take the front line, wherever it may be at the time of the announcement, and lock that into place. However, this creates another problem that consistent viewers of this channel are also familiar with. So let's put up another clock and get through this part fast as well. Freezing the front is really bad from the Kremlin's perspective. Not only is the ceasefire line nowhere close to its net gains from continuing the offensive, Ukraine is not stupid and will spend its time during the ceasefire building entrenchments. In turn, what Russia would expect to get from restarting a war will decrease. Right around the 20-second mark this time. Very nice. While few in the West will lose any sleep over Russia receiving a worse outcome, there is just one problem here. Remember that thing I told you to remember for later? Anyone fighting in a war gets a veto on a ceasefire. Here, that means Russia. I mean, the word ceasefire gives that away. It is not a ceasefire if one side ceases to fire, while the other side continues to fire. Consequently, if you want a ceasefire to work, you have to convince Russia to go along with it. And the trouble with instituting a ceasefire at the current line of control is that it is artificial. It does not match what the expected outcome of continued fighting is. In turn, you have to do something to get Russia to accept the proposal. Simply asking nicely will not work. Well, asking nicely has been the bulk of the Trump administration's strategy so far, and it seems that the Alaska dummit is not about to change things there, nor is Russia's behavior about to change. So if you want to move Russia's bargaining position, broadly, there are three common strategies available. One is to flood the other side with armaments, and continue to do so until the belligerent party agrees to stop. Trump has been stringing everyone along on this front for almost half of a year now, and there do not seem to be signs that that is changing. The onus is therefore on Europe to spend more to give Ukraine more options, with some portion of that still going to the United States to buy specialized equipment. I guess there was some movement on the White House's part with that. It is not a game changer, but it is notable. The second strategy is economic warfare. That seems to be where the Trump administration is leaning, with secondary sanctions on India to go in effect on August 27th. But that is a drop in the bucket, even as there are more reports of some Indian importers getting nervous and shifting their contracts elsewhere. It is hard to imagine that sticking with the advertised 25% tariff rate as a punishment for India importing Russian oil will lead to a long-term departure from its below-rate energy imports. The final option is what is called a peace subsidy, which is essentially giving economic inducements to a party, conditional on that party ending the war. The Camp David Accords under Jimmy Carter is the classic example of this in action. Entering the summit, it appeared that the Trump administration was leaning this way, hence that scheduled meeting among economic advisors. Watch for this to resurface again at the next summit. That said, the obvious problem with economic inducements is that they will strengthen the recipient over the long term. The other strategies do not have that effect. Consequently, this will put greater strain on the discussions of the enforceability of an agreement. Nevertheless, the Trump administration seems to be leaning this way because it is the cheaper option. Increased trade may not even be costly to the United States. It might be profitable. And the Trump administration does not care much if it is to the detriment of European security. Meanwhile, to the detriment of whatever you are currently reading, why not pick up one of these awesome books about the war? Check the video description for more information about them. And if you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.